Okay, so I have a question for Undersecretary Bonnie. When you look across the United States, what are the major barriers that you see that we face when it comes to addressing sustainability on the farm, but also just addressing the methane issue?
So I mentioned in my remarks that there's some skepticism in the countryside about what climate policy looks like. That's not as big as a barrier as it was probably 5-10 years ago. I don't spend a whole lot of time talking about climate science. I spend a lot of time talking about incentives and how we reward producers. But I do think in a business that is a commodity business and margins are tight, that incentives matter, markets matter, that convincing folks that they can make a go of this matters a lot. And so I think, part of our big challenge here, both on the farmers ranchers side as well as some of the skeptics on the environmental side, is proving that this stuff can actually work and having the data and science to back it up, that it works economically for folks and that it'll work for the climate as well.
Would you like to?
I would like to add, because I think measurement, and I really appreciate what USDA is spending on that, measurement really matters. Measurement helps everybody improve their own operations. It makes sure we're focused on the right things. And my biggest concern about this and other things that make claims about climate is that if we don't have the data and I will say a harmonized or consistent way of measuring, then I fear that that will do nothing to establish the trust that is it's the most precious commodity we all deal in. And so I just would add the work that you're doing, the data you're collecting for measurement, and then making sure that as we work in the marketplace with so many brands, that this is not about competition. This is about saving the planet and improving the outlook for people and health. So that's what I would hope, is that we could bring the whole family of the supply chain together.
Kumbaya.
So I'm going to add a tough question to that. When you read some of the literature that's out, and also I try to get literature that's sort of saying that they look at what we're doing on data and say it's greenwashing. How do you deal with that when you know that some of this data is real? And I'm just curious, how are you going to defend your data? Sorry.
Okay, Robert, you have more experience. It is a challenge, and that's part of finding a way. I always think where our best opportunity is to start the conversation on what all we have in common and the outcomes we're all looking for. And then oftentimes, this is kind of the phase that we're in. My science is better than your science. But if we have data that can show real life impacts, real life information on the farm, the economics as well as environmental benefit, the more we're able to measure the benefit, whether it's criteria pollutants or improving groundwater quality, being able to make every element of our waste stream being repurposed, and showing that. And we always find, but there's not enough time or space to take people to farms, to have a conversation with the farmers, to understand the complexity of the job that they have to balance every day. If we had opportunities to do that, that would make a big difference. But that's where I think young scientists, engaging community organizations from different ethnic backgrounds where there's a skepticism about government and generally, it is like thinking about all the ways community engagement at the most local level is always going to translate, I think, into better informed advocacy that we have to deal with at our levels.
Karen, you mentioned just now in your remarks skepticism about the government, and there's plenty of that. And so even while we make investments in better numbers, we need folks outside the government who are partners, respected, that we're working with. They're holding us accountable, and And I think about the universities play a critical role in all that. If the government does this alone, it's not going to have as much. It's not going to have as much impact as if we do it together. And so the partnerships with folks outside the government, I think, are really, really important. There are always going to be skeptics, for some having to do with the data and some having nothing to do with the data. And I think if we just show that we're serious about this, that we're following the science, and if we're partnering with the right folks outside of, in my case, Department of Agriculture, this one doesn't worry me that much.
Can I just add one thing? If we solely focus on farmers and ranchers, a lot of people feel left out. That's why it's so important to do what you're doing in the supply chain, that this goes all the way back to the consumer, but it starts on the farm, with the farm worker, with the employee, in the processing plant. And I think it's really important that we think about our engagement and not take for granted this is only about the farmers and ranchers. I think that's an important part of that broadening circle and inviting them to conferences like this, the transparency of, we're all in this room, we invite you to engage with us in helping to solve this really big problem.
And I think that your answers will actually apply to this next question, which was, how do we work best with the private sector to further the innovation? And I'm also concerned at how do we address some of the mistrust and skepticism that some of the consumers have when they see the university working with the private sector. So we've been having a few little attacks here and there about working with the private sector. What advice do you have for us? Because we know that's critical.
I mentioned some of the work we're doing in the coming weeks, where you're going to see USDA sort of step out into some of sort of elicit a deeper conversation around standards and methodologies and all those things. And I think that's a place where the question that we're trying to ask is, what role USDA, federal government, in the market in a way that it advances innovation, that enhances the incentives for folks to participate. And there's some things government are good at, and there's some things we're not as good at. And the question is, what are there things here that we could do that we're good at that will spur private investment? And so I think sort of a recognition that we can't do it all, and that there's a role for us to play, I think is really, really important. And again, in terms of our willingness to work with the private sector, yep, they're going to be skeptics there. And I think the most important thing we can do is show our work, be transparent. And we've tried to do that with the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. We have a learning network. We're posting data on the website. We're trying to be humble about all of this thing. We don't know all the answers. We don't know that everything's going to work. But I think if we show our work and we're building partnerships with folks outside, particularly in the research community that have a lot of credibility, we'll be okay.
And I don't like to show everybody my failures. I'd lots rather have you just see my successes. But I think it's also important to be able, as part of transparency, to say what worked, what didn't, and here's the conclusion we can draw from that, or this is why we need to do additional research, and not to be afraid of that. I mean, I know everyone's pressured of whether it's to do publications or to stand up in a room and be able to only give the good news. I'd lots rather do that than try to explain to somebody why I can't fix overregulation in California agriculture. I don't have an answer, so I just jump over that, just so y'all know. And so I think that the transparency, it has to be genuine, and it has to acknowledge what works and what doesn't, and that shouldn't be a ding. And, in state government, we don't really reward people if they get outside of the box we put everybody in, and that's bad. I mean, so you try something new and really innovative, and if it doesn't work, we add 12 more signatures to a file folder that takes 3 years to get through the process, slight exaggeration. That's an example of thinking differently about how we allow innovation in government spaces in addition to what we do throughout our supply chain.
So Karen, in your opening remarks, you said that we were about halfway there on the methane emissions. So my question is, what do we have to do to get to the finish line?
Well, obviously, we need additional investment. CARB, I think Virginia was at a 2022 report that showed the progress that is being made. And in fact, there have been a lot of hearings at the CARB this year. Is we do need a continued combination of additional dairy digesters, additional alternative manure management practices, and especially enteric fermentation solutions. That will be the magic sauce. And so they're trying to signal this needs additional investment. We want it to be on a voluntary basis as long as possible, but the law that passed said starting in 2025, regulations could be written if they didn't feel there's enough progress. And I feel that for some of the trust of the very strong skepticism around dairy digesters in particular, that there will be some additional reporting, I'm speculating here, of ways of being more transparent on an annual basis about what's happening out there. But I'm not at the CARB board. But the feed additives, improved genetics of the cow, better understanding of the rations, which are so precise now, all of these things are going to be part of the solution on the enteric part, which would really move the needle. But we also know, and I'm going to put my plug in, Undersecretary Bonnie, hydrogen from dairy methane would really be a very helpful. I think there's a yearning to make investments in that. The tax credit discussion that's happening at the federal level right now does not seem to be supportive because of fear about the release of carbon dioxide in that process. But this is new technology for yet another answer on a fuel that we just have to continue to work to signal that is a place that we think there's worthwhile investment. Not to overstate your role there, but if you would just go call the White House and take care of that right now, I'd appreciate it.
Just like that. Actually, one of the interesting things about tax credits, both the hydrogen side and the sustainable aviation fuel side, which has big opportunities for livestock methane there as well, is that when we're hearing from the Hill, we're hearing from both sides of the aisle, which is a really good thing. And if you think about the issues facing, whether it's issues related to FDA approval or some of these issues in the with tax policy, we need bipartisanship. And there's a lot of reasons that this is going to benefit livestock producers, rural communities, folks in the supply chain, international competitiveness. And so I think that there are actually real opportunities here. And to me, the conversations around the tax credit, hydrogen and otherwise, has actually proven that. And we've still got a lot of work to do there, as you well know. But there is, what we're hearing from the Hill is they're not debating climate science or anything. They're seeing opportunity here. And the more we can construct things that folks see opportunity for their constituents in while solving the problem, the better. And I think the conversation around the tax credits have really demonstrated that.
So we have 3 minutes. Both of you have traveled all over the world, and I'm just wondering have you seen any investments, programs around methane in other countries that could potentially be adaptable here?
We've talked about it a lot, especially with our friends and colleagues in the Netherlands, in particular, Denmark as well. That's all at a different scale. Those are the 2 countries that I've been in most recently where there's much more focus on this because animal protein is a huge part of the diet of the people who live there, as well as for Europe, even though there's a push now to change that. But so many small farms are in the livestock sector, and they're looking for smaller scale solutions that would work. And so those are the 2 countries where I've seen the most opportunities for collaboration, but the desire for solutions is global. I have not been to Brazil yet. One of my staff members, Roberta, would tell me that I need to go to Brazil and check that out.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, there are things we can actually learn from folks in Europe and elsewhere, their use of feed additives, and but I also mentioned the other aspect of what some of the policy we're seeing in Europe, that we got tractors in the streets of European capitals on this, and we're not going to do this unless agriculture and forestry comes along with us. And I think there are a lot of countries around the world that actually have spent a lot of time looking at California, and now they're looking at the U.S. and some of the investments we're making. For forever, everybody assumed that we were going to address forests and agriculture through cap and trade, global cap and trade, national cap and trade, and cap and trade is going to be important. Those markets are going to be really important. We're in this interesting time right now where there are a lot of potential solutions sort of vying for supremacy, if you were, out here. And so I think this is an important time, and I think the investments we make in demonstrating that this can work, that this voluntary, incentive-based, collaborative, market-based approach can work, and that we've got the data to prove it, I think this is a critical time essentially to prove our theory.
I have to add, and I apologize to my friends from New Zealand. New Zealand has set very ambitious goals for enteric fermentation reductions because they're primarily pasture-based, and so they're a hugely important player, and my apologies to the former ag minister's
Likewise.
friend.
Well, thank you, Undersecretary Bonnie and Secretary Ross. We really appreciate it, and I believe we have a break now, and I'll just give the mic right now.
Thank you very much. Can we have some applause for our panel?